everyone, and welcome to my final video for VLOGOWEEN. If you were watching this the day I posted it, then I hope y'all are having a very happy Halloween, but if you're watching it afterwards, then I hope y'all had a very happy Halloween full of spooky, festive fun. For today's video, I am going to be sharing with you my wrap-up for October. I actually read 11 books in October, which is the most I've read in a month this year alone, but just like in general, I think that's like the second most I've ever read in a month, and I actually really enjoyed a lot of the books that I read this month, so this was a super successful reading month. So as per usual, let's just jump into some statistics that I have here on my laptop. So in October, I read a grand total approximately of like 3,050 pages. 4 of the books that I read were contemporary romances, 1 was a mystery, 1 was nonfiction, 1 was historical fiction, 1 was a horror, 1 was a thriller, and then 2 of them were short stories, which one was a short story that I just didn't know what other genre to categorize it as, and then the other one was a poetry collection. I had 2 2.5 star reads, 1 3.5 star, 4 4 stars, 3 4.5 stars, and 1 5-star read. 1 was an ebook, and 10 of them were physical books. 7 were adult, and 4 were YA, and I also had 1 reread, which I just figured I'd throw in there for you. And then, as per usual, I also like to go over the years that the books were released. So this month there was a 2014, 2015, 2019, 2017, 2019, 2017, 2019, 2018, 2018, 1997, and 2016. So most of them were pretty new, but then we had one oldie from the 90s. So yeah, since I have 11 books to go through, let's just jump right into it. I'm not going to linger too much on each book because I don't want this to be like 2 hours long, so let's just get started. First book that I read in October was To All the Boys I've Loved Before by Jenny Han. This is a book that I'm sure a lot of people know about at this point with the whole movie and everything that came out, but just in case you don't, in this book we follow a girl called Lara Jean, and anytime she really likes a guy, like she has a really big crush on him, she writes him a love letter but doesn't end up sending it out. And then one day, all 5 of these letters get sent out to these different guys, and she kind of has to deal with the repercussions of that. Obviously, I'm very late to the game with reading this book. I avoided it for such a long time because contemporary romances tend to be very hit or miss for me, and this one like didn't super draw my attention, so I just never picked it up. But then so many people loved the book, and then the movie came out and people loved that too, and I felt like I was really missing out on something, so I decided to just pick it up. And I honestly kind of went into it thinking I wasn't gonna like it, but I actually loved it. And I basically gave it 5 stars, 4.5 if we're being really specific, but I just loved this story so much. I had no idea everything that was going to go on in this book. Like, the synopsis that I gave you, which is what a lot of people explain when they explain this book, actually is only a very small portion of like the beginning of the story. There's this whole other thing that goes on. There's the fake dating trope, which I didn't realize I loved so much, but the only other time I've read the fake dating trope, besides one other book that I read this month that I didn't like, but we'll get to that later, was in The Fill-In Boyfriend by Casey West, which is my favorite Casey West book. That had the fake dating trope, and I loved it in that book, and I loved it in this book. So if you have any fake dating book recommendations, do leave them in the comments, because I'm very interested in that trope now. But yeah, I just love this book. I found Lara Jean to be a very kind of relatable character. One thing that really specifically stood out to me that I found very relatable was her like driving anxiety, which I haven't found like depicted in books or movies that I have seen. So I really appreciated that, and I just loved the romance in this story, so I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. And of course I had to just jump right into the sequel, which is P.S. I Still Love You. I gave this 4 stars, so I didn't like it quite as much as the first one, but I still really enjoyed it. This one dove into some other like side plots that I wasn't as interested in. I really just loved the romance in these books. I almost said who they were between, but that would have been a spoiler. But I'm sure most people have already read it, so it wouldn't have been a big deal. But anyways, I really just loved that romance going on. But this book had some other like side plots that I wasn't as into, so that's why I didn't like this one as much. Also, I feel like this one had just a little bit more drama, just a little too much drama for me at times, so that's another reason that I kind of docked the rating a little bit. And then, of course, I had to dive right into the final book, which is Always and Forever, Lara Jean, and this one I think takes place like a year after the second one ends, and I also gave this one 4 stars. This really focused on like them going to college, and again there was some more drama, and I just wasn't super into either of those storylines that were going on. So again, I only gave it a 4, but I still really enjoyed it. I still loved the romance in this book, and I will say, I'm not a crier when it comes to books, but there was something right at the end of this book that I teared up just a little bit. Just enough that it's worth mentioning, because that never happens. So this book, it did something. I then read a nonfiction book called Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs by Caitlin Doty. Caitlin Doty is a mortician and she's also a YouTuber. She's written 2 other nonfiction books which I read earlier this year and absolutely loved. So this is her most recent one, and as soon as it came out I got it from the library, and I also loved this one and gave it 4 out of 5 stars. All of her books tend to revolve around death in one way or the other. In this book she took questions from kids, and obviously kids have like no filter and they don't have any idea of like the kind of taboo subject that death is, so a lot of their questions were either like really kind of deep that you wouldn't really expect a kid to ask, but they also haven't had that thought put in their head that death is something that they shouldn't really talk about yet. So some of the questions were really deep, some of them were kind of funny. All around they were totally valid questions that I really wanted to know the answers to because I didn't know either. And yeah, I just loved this book. I felt like I learned a lot from it. It was super interesting. Just because it's questions from kids does not mean it is just for kids. I think anybody could read this book, and I'm sure there's probably parents out there that don't want kids to read this book and learn some of the stuff. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I found it really interesting, and like I said, I felt like I learned a lot, so I would totally recommend it to everybody. Next up, I picked up The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren. This is an adult romance book. I was super excited to read this since it came out earlier this year. In this book, we follow a girl called Olive, and her twin sister is getting married, but at the wedding, unfortunately, everybody ends up getting horrible food poisoning except for Olive and the best man, who is Olive's sister's husband's brother, but they're also like don't get along at all. So Olive's sister and her husband insist that the 2 of them take their honeymoon instead since they can't, and so they kind of try to put their differences aside and go on this trip to Hawaii. And I really wanted to love this book, but unfortunately it just did not work for me, and I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. It also had the fake dating trope in it, which I enjoyed, but then it also had the hate to love trope in it, which I didn't like as much. Usually I think I do like that trope a little bit more, but my main problem with this book was the characters. So I think because I didn't really like the characters, I didn't really like their hate to love story. So yeah, that was like my biggest issue. I'm a very character-driven reader, and I just did not connect with these characters at all. I didn't really find them to be particularly likable, and yeah, it wasn't the book for me, which I'm very disappointed about, but I know a lot of other people liked it, so it's definitely like a it's me not you kind of situation, so yeah. I then picked up Midnight at the Bright Ideas Bookstore by Matthew Sullivan. This is an adult mystery / thriller. More people on Goodreads categorized it as a mystery than a thriller, but who's to say what's the real difference between those two? I think it could be for fans of either of those genres. But in this book we follow a girl who is kind of trying to run from her past or hide from her past, which is kind of more revealed as the story progresses, but she is working in this bookstore called Bright Ideas Bookstore, and one of the regulars that visits there often hangs himself in the top floor, and when she finds him, in his pocket is a picture of her from when she was a child, and so it kind of brings up all these memories of her past. And I really loved this book as well. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It didn't have like the best ratings on Goodreads, or at least like from my friends on Goodreads that I was like reading through, not a lot of people gave it super high ratings, so I wasn't really sure what to expect going into it, but I actually really liked it. I really liked the characters. I was able to connect with the main character, and I found the whole story to be very interesting. I didn't predict a lot of the kind of twists and turns, and it was very intriguing and kind of suspenseful, which is why I think it could easily be considered a thriller, because it had basically all of the elements of a thriller. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think this is a bit of an underrated and not as well known mystery thriller book, so I really hope that more people will pick this book up. I then picked up The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. I actually did a full review video of this on my channel, so rather than repeating myself, I would direct you over to that video if you want to learn more about this book and my thoughts on it. And in case I forget to link it, it will probably be linked at the end of this video anyway. But yeah, if you did read this book, please go over and discuss it with me in the comments, because this was a pretty interesting book, and yeah, that's all I'm gonna say. I gave it 3.5 stars. I will say that. I then read Elevation by Stephen King. I read this as an ebook, and this is the one short story that I wasn't really sure what to categorize it as, because on Goodreads a lot of people had it as a horror, but I would not consider this to be a horror book at all. If anything, I would say it's closest to maybe like science fiction, possibly. But in this book we're following a guy called Scott, and he has this mysterious disease that is making him rapidly lose weight, but he doesn't physically look like he's losing weight, and all of his clothes still fit him, and like if he steps on a scale by himself, he will weigh the same as if he stepped on the scale holding a ton of bricks. So this story is just kind of a strange one, which is why I don't really know how to categorize it, but I definitely don't think it's a horror. It's definitely not like horrifying in any way. It's just kind of a strange story, and it was a bit boring throughout, so I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. Also, I don't think this is really considered a spoiler, but even at the end of the book, we never figure out what this weird disease is or like why it started happening, so you don't really get any questions answered, but it did have a very like nice ending, so that's why I gave it 2.5 stars. So yeah, I don't like regret reading the book by any means, but I also don't know if I'd necessarily recommend it, so this is just kind of a book I read this month. It was weird, it had a nice ending. That's that. Next book I finished was The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein. This is another book that I waited so long to read. It's been sitting on my shelf since it came out, which I think it came out of October of 2018. So this has been sitting on my shelf for a year, waiting to be read, and I really wish I hadn't waited as long because I absolutely loved this book, and again I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, but basically a 5-star read. If you don't already know, this book is based off of Frankenstein. I read Frankenstein back in 2016, so I honestly don't know how much of this actually follows the original story, but it basically follows the story of Frankenstein but told from Elizabeth's perspective. So yeah, I can't really say how much of the story is actually true to the original just because I honestly can't remember the original at all. That being said, after reading this, I'm really interested in rereading Frankenstein, so I might do that sometime soon. But yeah, this book, I just loved it. I know a lot of people on Goodreads categorize this as a horror as well, but I would consider it to be more of a historical fiction with horror elements, as well as just being like a tragic love story, which is my favorite kind of love story to read. I know that sounds really sad, but I can't help it. I just love those kinds of stories, and that's definitely what this was, and I loved every aspect of that story in this book. The only reason I didn't give it a full 5 stars was because it was a little bit slow, and I think that's the reason that a lot of other people may not like this book, because it's very character driven, and as we've established, I'm a very character driven reader, so it's no surprise that I liked it. But the plot may not be fast enough, or it's not even really a super like strong plot, maybe, I don't know, so I feel like that's the reason a lot of people wouldn't like this as much. So yeah, the only reason I didn't give it a full 5 stars was because it was a little bit slow at times, and also there was a little part at the ending that I thought, just for my own like personal preference, could have been a little bit better. And I actually read this for Spookathon, or Spooktober actually, which I vlogged, and I don't know if that video is going up before or after this, but in that video I did dive into a little bit of spoilers for this book. I do warn you when it's going to happen, so just in case you haven't read this and you don't want to be spoiled, you won't be spoiled by watching that video because I do tell you when it's going to happen, but I dive into what about the ending I thought could have just been a little bit better. But overall, I really enjoyed this book and I would totally recommend it. The next book that I picked up was The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy and Other Stories by Tim Burton, and this was my reread. Also, apologies for the appearance of this book. It has like a cloth cover and it attracts a lot of cat hair, so that is what's happening right now. But yeah, this was my reread. I think I read this last year and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and then I reread it this year and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I just love this book. It's a collection of poetry. I would describe it as like Dr. Seuss, but really twisted and definitely not for children. I just love Tim Burton and I love his dark sense of humor, and this also has all sorts of like illustrations in it, which have his classic Tim Burton feel to it, and I just absolutely love it. Obviously, if you do not understand like his darker sense of humor and just like the darker things in general, then this definitely would not be the book for you, but is just my cup of tea, so I absolutely loved it. And then the final book that I read in October, I actually finished this morning, and that's I'm Thinking of Ending Things. This is a book that has been on my radar for a while, but I just never picked it up until yesterday night, and I'm so glad that I did because I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. In this book, we follow a girl who remains unnamed throughout the novel, but she is driving with her boyfriend to go and visit his parents for the first time, but she is kind of contemplating ending things with her boyfriend. So that's all I'm going to really tell you about the synopsis. I would consider this to be like an adult horror, I guess, maybe thriller. Most people on Goodreads categorized it as a horror, so that's just what I'm gonna say for the sake of this video. But this book, I don't even know how to like verbalize my thoughts on this book. So before I picked up this book last night, I read some reviews of it on Goodreads, like reviews that my friends on Goodreads had written, and not a lot of people had read this book as far as like my friends, but so the people that had, there was like 2 4 or 5 star ratings, like people that really liked it. There were a couple like 3 mediocre stars, and then there was just like 1 star ratings. But across the board, the same thing that was in almost everybody's review was this book made me feel really uneasy, but I don't know why. And I can totally get that, and that's exactly how I felt while reading it, which I don't really understand. Like I said, I don't know why I felt this way, because for a good chunk of this story, we're just following them driving and like having conversations, and sometimes the girl would like recount stories from her past, whether it was like just to her boyfriend or to us as the reader, and it would either be like from her childhood, just some weird story, or like a story of how she met the boyfriend and something nice he did for her. And at the time, the stories just kind of seem a bit odd and out of place. Like when you read the ending, then they kind of make sense, but they're not particularly like scary or suspenseful or something that should make you feel uneasy. But for some reason, the entire time when they're just like driving and stuff and it seems almost kind of boring, you just feel really uncomfortable and uneasy and suspenseful and like a little bit afraid, which I don't get freaked out that easily. Like books and movies don't really scare me, but I felt like the uneasiness that's more on the side of like a bit of fear. So props to this book for making me feel like that. And yeah, that's what I mean when I don't know how to explain my thoughts, because obviously I gave it a very high rating, but I wouldn't say that this is a book I particularly enjoyed. But because a book was able to make me feel that way and have like no idea why, that book is like pretty cleverly written. So that's why I gave it such a high star rating. And also, like, this book had me completely gripped. I read it in 2 sittings, which is really unlike me, and I just could not put the book down. The only reason I didn't give it a full 5 stars was because I did predict the ending, but also like I was just as like awestruck at the ending even though I knew it was gonna happen. It's really weird. I really don't know how to explain this book, and this is definitely not the book for everybody. I don't even know who to recommend it to, because like some of my friends on Goodreads who like horror books, but I don't actually share a lot of the same reading taste as them, loved it. And then other people on Goodreads who like horror books, who I share a lot of the same reading tastes, didn't like it. So I'm just really confused. I don't know who to recommend it to. You're gonna have to read it at your own risk, but just know that I thought it was very cleverly done and I would recommend it. So that's that. Not very helpful, but that's all I can really say. So those were all of the books that I read in October. Leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!
You hear that, Samson?